Hello everyone. Okay, in this, the first of a little series of videos, we're going to have a look at the powers of the American presidency with regards to foreign affairs. I suppose the fundamental question is going to be, did the founding fathers make a boo-boo? Is there a constitutional loophole regarding foreign affairs? Now, this question is one which could come on the exam. It could be part of a wider set of questions around, about the view that the American president is too powerful. They could link it in one of these double-barrel questions with something else, Congress versus the presidency or the Supreme Court versus the presidency, something like that. So it's really essential that you kind of know these arguments around the presidency and foreign affairs. I know when it has been asked in the past, it's quite a popular type of question. So the first thing we're going to have to do then, and again you should already kind of know this, is look at his constitutional powers in terms of foreign affairs. Okay. So constitutionally, the President of the United States is the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. He appoints, with Senate approval, diplomats and ambassadors, and he has regular meetings, or he has meetings with them. Again, you can find an example of an ambassador. I'm pretty sure you can find one pretty easily. Find out who the UK ambassador is in the United States, for example. He appoints, again with Senate approval, the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defence. He makes treaties, which requires Senate approval. And, the Senate doesn't always approve of these treaties. In 2012, for example, it rejected the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And essentially, these constitutional powers given to the presidency in terms of foreign affairs make him chiefly responsible for foreign affairs. And as a consequence of that, he's gained quite a lot of informal powers as well around the setting of the foreign policy agenda, etc., etc. Okay, now there are a number of checks on this power. The founding fathers weren't completely negligent. So, for example, Congress can declare war. Okay, not the president. Congress has the power of the purse. In other words, they need to approve the money for the army to be commander-in-chief of, or the money to pay for foreign ambassadors, which again can be significant. And the Senate must approve of key appointments as well, as we saw on the previous slide. Congress as well, which I didn't really write down here, can also do investigations, which might include foreign affairs. I know this morning on Radio 4, this is March 2023, there was a thing on about how, I think it was the Senate, I'm not entirely sure which chamber it was, there was some committee anyway, running an investigation into Joe Biden and the handling of the withdrawal of forces from Afghanistan last year. And they were interviewing yesterday some of the soldiers that were involved in that. Okay, so the question might be, well, why did the founding fathers not put more checks on the president? No, considering the fact they were so scared of executive power, allegedly, were so frightened of, governments taking away citizens' rights and all the rest of it, why did they not put more checks on the president when it came to foreign affairs? They do seem to give him quite a wide range. And in fact, very often, presidents in their second term, or when they've fallen out with Congress, i.e. different parties taken over, they very often tend to turn to foreign affairs because it's far easier to have kind of your inputs and your impact in terms of foreign affairs than it is events at home. So the question is why? And there's a couple of reasons. One reason, of course, if you think back to 1787, America was surrounded by lots of potential enemies. There were these 13 colonies, which were fairly weak at the time. They'd just beaten, if you like, the global superpower of the day, the UK or Great Britain. Wanted to say that Britain might not turn against them in the future. The French had helped them in the war against Britain back in 1787. Again, the question might arise, what if France turns against them? You had Spain, who had a lot of influence over South America. Again, they are a potential threat. So you need someone who's kind of on the spot, so to speak, who can actually take decisions and take actions relatively quickly. If you had to call a congress, if you had to kind of faff around having lots of arrangements in order to engage in foreign affairs, who knows? You may well be invaded by the time you've got it all sorted. So the fact America's surrounded by potential enemies is possibly one reason why they did not put more checks on the presidency. A second reason is an economic reason, the fact they need to make new trade agreements pretty quickly in 1787. Again, having one person doing the negotiating for these sorts of agreements is far easier than trying to negotiate, with 535 members of Congress. And then there's something called manifest destiny. The Americans believed back in 1787, and arguably you could say they still do, is that they've kind of got a God-given right, there's this providence from God, basically, which has enabled them to defeat the Great Britain, to establish the colonies, and this idea that they've got a right to North America. So they're going to be quite expansionist right from the start. And so again, in order to expand and move further westwards, I always get east and west mixed up in America for some reason. To move further westwards, you needed to have someone who's in charge of the military, etc., etc., who can kind of coordinate all this. There's also the argument that actually America, the founding fathers might have thought it wasn't actually all that powerful. They're 3,000 miles away from anybody else. What harm could they do, essentially? So there's always that potential argument as well, which they may have had. And they may have thought they had enough checks on him already. I mean, back in 1787, countries did declare war before they used the troops. Today, it's a bit quaint, I think, if a country did that, really. Back in the day, I hate saying that back in the day, but back in 1787, the power of the purse, the match that was really important. In fact, it still is, arguably. Congress, they may have thought that Congress may have been a bit more difficult to persuade to use the military, to use money to pay for the military, whereas in reality Congress often just seems to agree. So they may have felt they've had to put enough checks on the presidency, and so they might be quite disappointed, I suspect, or some of them may have been disappointed by what's happened as a consequence. So, as well as these constitutional powers, the presidency as well has actually sought to increase their powers. And you might think they're a bit greedy, I suppose. One of the ways they've done this is that they've got around the treaty-making process, or they've tried to get around the treaty-making process anyway. And one way they've done this is by, instead of signing formal treaties, which requires, the Senate approval and all the bells and whistles around that, they often sign agreements with head of states instead. Now, these agreements don't require 2/3 Senate approval. There's also have things called congressional executive agreements as well, which are basically the same thing. But what they have is that they seek to have support from Congress. And this, I think, is becoming the more popular way. So rather than doing a treaty, which requires all the Senate approval business, a lot of deals these days tend to be done through congressional executive agreements. And what you often find is that they'll seek the support of Congress, and Congress will issue a joint resolution of approval, i.e. a resolution from the House, a resolution from the Senate to say yay or nay, and it's done that way. Some examples is the Iran nuclear deal. Had a joint resolution of support from Congress, but it was an agreement made between Obama and Iran, and also Britain and France were involved as well. So that's just one example of recent times of one of these. So executive agreements, and I can't remember the figures at the top of my head. I did have them to hand. There's been something like 900 formal treaties and about 5,000 or 6,000 executive agreements, which kind of shows which one is the more popular. Now, the downside about doing executive agreements is that because it hasn't had Senate approval 2/3, it's got the same status as a treaty. The Supreme Court has stated this. However, it's kind of easier for a future president to change executive agreements. Whereas if it's been a formal treaty and had the 2/3 Senate approval, it's kind of got a bit more permanence about it. So that's the kind of downside, I suppose, around them. And they have been around a long time. I mean, back in 1820, the Supreme Court upheld that they were constitutional. So I'm not sure whether George Washington used any. I suspect he may well have done. They suddenly go back in time, the use of these things. So that's one way he's increased power. He's tried to get around this Senate business. They also use crises. Now, I think it was Winston Churchill who famously said, "Why waste a good crisis?" or something like that. And crises are a way of presidents, again, to increase their role in foreign affairs. So if you think to the Second World War, you know, you had isolationism after the First World War, America withdrew from the world. But at the end of the Second World War and the crisis of the Second World War, you know, the need to rearm and the need to coordinate armed forces and the military and all that business, the presidency kind of grew in its stature regarding foreign affairs. 9/11 as well. Again, the events after that led to a growth of the federal government. You saw the Department of Homeland Security being created under George W. Bush. You've seen you know, things like the Patriot Act and all these means, which again has increased the role of the presidency regarding foreign affairs. Now, I've also put down secret deals. I suppose the problem with these are often secret, but presidents sometimes might make deals kind of a bit behind the scenes. They tend to only become public when something goes wrong. And famously, or not, President Reagan nearly got into impeachment territory over something called the Iran-Contra affair. You don't need to know the details, but basically he did a deal behind the backs of Congress to kind of support the Contras in Nicaragua. I can never say that. And Iran was involved as well. It involved military things with Iran. Congress told him not to do it. He did it anyway. And he very nearly got impeached for it, but didn't. And of course, linked to the crisis one, I suppose, another major reason why America, or the American president, sorry, has become so important in terms of foreign affairs is the fact America itself is now so much more important regarding foreign affairs. No, America is now a world superpower, which obviously it wasn't back in 1787. You know, it's got the world's largest military. It does have this really important role regarding foreign affairs, which has also made the presidency so important because obviously they play a leading role. Okay, I think my time's up on this particular one, so I'll do another video on the next part.